one more interview. It's just impossible to count how many of them there were in more than 9 decades of life. But Warren Buffett didn't ignore the press, even now. Even though he knew the journalist would be asking the same questions again, Warren wondered if something new would follow, or if everything would go according to the usual pattern. Is it even achievable to become a rich person by playing in the stock market for many decades and still be a rich man at a very advanced age? There are very few such examples in history, but they do exist. And one of them is certainly Warren Buffett. A legendary guru for investors around the entire world, he is still successfully running his business. Nonetheless, the capitalization of his company Berkshire Hathaway exceeds $500 billion, and it seems that its owner does not intend to stop there. But how did he manage to achieve such impressive results? And let's ask himself, how to become rich? Hey dear viewer, good day from Wealth History Channel. Today the topic under discussion is the man, the investor, and just a phenomenal guru for many, Warren Buffett, and his wealth. Stay with us. Start counting your money now. Well, the famous billionaire gave the answer to it for himself a long time ago. Of course, being born into a family of a businessman and then a congressman is a certain bonus in life, for sure. But there were so many young people who then got lost in life and could not achieve anything, and in the end, no one remembered them. In contrast, Warren knew the value of money from childhood and knew how to keep track of it. At the age of 13, he began working as a newspaper delivery man. At the same time, he filed a declaration of his income for the first time, not forgetting to deduct the cost of the purchased wristwatch and bicycle. To put it simply, according to American law, the purchase of work-related tools is not taxed, and young Buffett took advantage of this. In other words, he learned how to count money from a young age and realized that it doesn't come out of nowhere. Surprisingly, the career of the future great investor began even earlier, at the age of only 11 years old. That's when he, along with his sister Doris, purchased 3 preferred shares at a price of $38.25. The money belonged to his sister, and by that time, being a wise man, Buffett recalled that at that time he was very worried. Back then it was significant money. And for the rest of his life, he will remember his first trade. In the first days, the rate dropped to $27, and it definitely gave him goosebumps, but then it began to grow and reached $40. After that, Warren immediately sold the shares and made a net profit of as much as $5. $5 according to those standards. Learn patience and it will be rewarded. It would seem that he should rejoice and end of story, but the value of these shares continued to grow and eventually reached $200 per share. In other words, if Buffett had the patience to wait a little longer, he would have earned 2 orders of magnitude more, about $500. By his own claim, this episode was a lifelong lesson for him. He understood that it's incredibly important for an investor to be patient and not panic. Not to focus on short-term gains, because one can earn much more in the long run. That is, then he got an initial idea of strategic planning. Buffett's second investment was with his own money, albeit in a share with a friend. They bought a used pinball machine for $25 and, after agreeing with the owner of a local barbershop, installed it there. And then, over the next 3 months, they used the earnings to buy a few more vending machines, which went to 3 other barbershops. The business turned out to be quite successful, but in the end, by the final quarter of the year, it was sold on a turnkey basis for $1,200, which was many times higher than the total amount of investment of $25. And Buffett himself later admitted that it was a very useful experience for him, which allowed him to learn a few more rules of investing. And when asked about the main rules of an investor, the first thing he invariably says is this: when you make money in the market for the first time, you may be tempted to spend it, but don't do it. After all, it is much better to reinvest profits in order to multiply them. And at the same time, he remembered those for whom the first money earned was brain blow-up, and they began to spend it on high-status consumption, demonstrating to everyone the wealth and instant status that fell on them. Fools. It'll quickly get away from them. But if the money was invested in other projects or expansion of the same thing, it could be earned even more. Be careful with your loans. Another question put to him did not require hesitation. It was about loans. Can an investor borrow money into the business, or is it better for him to refrain from doing so? Buffett has long since answered it. He has never borrowed large sums of money because you take someone else's money and for a while, and give your own forever. It's a joke. but there is just a bit of a joke in it. How many times a variety of people have told him that their debts are quite reasonable and still manageable, and after a while, they reach such a value that they cease to be such. Inexperienced investors got carried away and lost control of the situation. While according to the billionaires, one of the deepest conviction, if a person is free of debt, he should use mainly his own funds for investments. In order to invest them, you can save money or, as a last resort, try to negotiate with creditors on feasible payments, as much as anyone can. Mr. Buffett, should investors take risks? After all, the higher the risk, the greater the probable profit, right? Buffett shook his head in denial. He didn't like taking too many risks, and he often talked about his unwillingness to become financially dependent on others, since, in this case, he loses the freedom of action and non-standard moves with which he has repeatedly surprised the market. For example, during the 2008 crisis, he bought shares of Goldman Sachs, General Electric, as well as Harley-Davidson, which then fell sharply in price. But then the rate went up again, and his company Berkshire Hathaway made a good profit, to the envy of those who then hurried to dump assets that were rapidly losing value. And there were a lot of them. Create different sources of income. Yes, and about his own company. Warren vividly remembered when and how he got it. It was in the year 1965. So he decided to add a controlling stake in a more than century-old textile company to his investment portfolio, which had been in trouble in recent years. But since the US textile industry at that time began to decline in general, the emphasis began to be placed on much cheaper products from Southeast Asia. Buffett gradually began to expand the profile of activities. At first, he became interested in insurance, then in other areas of activity. In general, he pretty much understood another secret of a successful investor, namely, the need to diversify assets in order to minimize the risks he dislikes quite a lot and achieve maximum profit. And now his holding Berkshire Hathaway owns shares in a whopping 65 companies, plus 260 offshoots, which allows the investor to feel truly calm. Mr. Buffett, you've been called, honestly speaking, the Wizard of Omaha for your unparalleled sense and ability to predict the future. But have you always been like that? The journalist asked his next question. Buffett smiled and shook his head again. Of course not, and he remembered well the incident, which was a serious lesson for him. He was still a teenager at the time, and one day he decided to try his luck at the racetrack, that is, to guess the results of horse races. But here he failed. He lost the first bet, and then the second one, and then he would have stopped, but no. Warren, heated by excitement, began to bet again and again, trying to win back. And as a result, not only was he unable to do so, but he also lost almost all of his earnings after a week of working. You shouldn't persist in your mistake. But then he understood a simple truth. The ability to stop in time is very important for an investor. No one is immune to mistakes, and there is no tragedy in losing some money. However, you should not persist in your mistake and even more so repeat the mistake. In this case, it is much better to admit the one and start looking for other investment chances. And as a teenager, Buffett realized another truth. You should not blindly follow someone else's opinion and base your decisions on the words and actions of other people, and accept that you will be considered a strange person, as is always the case with those who separate themselves from the crowd, and accept your differences and make it your strong sides. Such was the case with him when he began to work with money. But by the age of 30, his fortune reached $100 million, and most of those who considered him doomed to fail went bankrupt and left the scene fully. And this strengthened his conviction that he should be guided only by his own thoughts and moral convictions, and not by the advice of all sorts of gurus. Don't invest in something you don't understand. Which automatically led him to another truth. You shouldn't invest in something you don't understand, and you shouldn't make deals with a person or company you don't trust. Even if you can make good money on it, the risk of losing is also there, and it's present nonetheless. We can add that you can also lose your previously earned reputation. Warren, is reputation really so important to you? The journalist couldn't help but ask him. Buffett nodded his head. It takes 20 years to build a reputation, and it takes 5 minutes to destroy it. If you think about it, you'll do it differently. He replied confidently. Even more so, over time it becomes clear that money is not the main measure of success. And so the famous investor, whose fortune exceeded $110 billion American dollars, added, "When you get to my age, you'll measure your success by how many of the people you've loved really love you. It's one of the biggest indicators of how you've lived your life." But then the interview ended, and the journalist left the billionaire, hurrying to publish it in his publication as soon as possible. Buffett smiled slightly and shook his head. People change very little, and his advice is unlikely to help many. Though, if at least 1 out of 100 who heard them takes advantage of this, then it's not bad at all. And then everything will depend only on these people. Thank you for watching this episode. In case if you enjoyed it, leave a like and subscribe to be notified when new episodes will come out. For now, till next time on Wealth History Channel.